Yet even that didn't slow his pace. During May alone, he traveled for 25 days, during which he preached in 58 different cities, 51 of which had never been visited by a Protestant missionary. During this time, the Civil War reached a major turning point as Shanghai finally fell before the imperial government forces. Hudson Taylor was traveling at the time with older missionaries toward Suzhou's Lake. They had only been gone a few days when, looking back toward Shanghai from the top of the hill, they saw so much smoke they knew it could mean just one thing: Shanghai was in flames. Worried for the safety of the families and friends they'd left behind in the foreign settlement, the group set out at once to return to the city. Even before they reached Shanghai itself, their fears were confirmed by fleeing rebels who begged for their protection. But there was nothing Hudson or his friends could do to help them. In fact, the men were quickly captured by imperial forces and beheaded before the missionaries' eyes. Hurrying on toward the foreign settlement with growing apprehension, they witnessed more evidence of terrible destruction wherever they turned. But upon finally reaching the walls of the foreign settlement itself, they were relieved to find it just as they had left it. Perhaps because the imperialist troops were satiated by the slaughter they inflicted on the rebels and the native population of Shanghai, they were too exultant over their conquest to pay much attention to the foreigners. Hudson Taylor wrote home in this report: "Shanghai is now in peace, but it is like the peace of death. 2,000 people at the very least have perished, and the torture some of the victims have undergone cannot be exceeded by the worst barbarities of the Inquisition. The city is a little more than a mass of ruins, and many of the wretched objects who survive are piteous to behold." But the worst of the danger was over. Hudson Taylor and his colleagues now gave themselves to caring for the spiritual and physical needs of Shanghai's survivors, while they waited anxiously for the reply of their society to the suggestions for more settled work. Having seen the opportunities and the needs firsthand, Hudson and the Parkers prayed, asking God for a strategy that would make them most useful in China. They concluded that their mission needed to purchase land in Shanghai. On that day, they should build medical facilities for Dr. Parker to establish a practice, and also a permanent base from which they could launch more itinerant evangelism ventures inland. So, after much discussion and prayer, they wrote to the secretaries requesting the necessary money. With the fall of Shanghai to the imperialists, the timing became even more crucial. Now that the siege had ended and rebuilding had begun, the local economy was set to take off. Thousands of Chinese opportunists began pouring into the city from the surrounding region. Their presence, plus a new influx of like-minded foreigners, sent prices soaring once again. Months passed as the missionaries waited for word on the request. The heat of the summer, meanwhile, was overpowering in the crowded quarters. A brief visit to the great coastal city of Ningpo, over 100 miles to the south, opened up an appealing alternative to their uncertain situation in Shanghai. Several missionary groups in that city, sensing the need for a hospital to supplement their otherwise effective ministries, proposed that Dr. Parker move to that city to establish a medical work. The different agencies represented there even pledged the financial support needed for Dr. Parr to get started in Ningpo. Still, Hudson and the Parkers awaited word on their proposal for establishing a permanent mission headquarters in Shanghai. The need for an answer became even more crucial as they received notice that the house they were sharing with another family would be needed shortly for members of the mission to which it belonged. And still there were no other rooms for rent anywhere in the settlement or the city. Finally, the answer came. But what a discouraging answer it was. The committee had made a firm decision. They said their organization was philosophically opposed to spending money on buildings in the ports because they saw that their mission and that of their workers to be the evangelization of the interior. They didn't want to be hampered by getting too rooted in the port cities. While the decision must have seemed a sound one from where the secretary sat on the other side of the world, and while their missionaries in China shared the vision for carrying the gospel into the interior, the decision did nothing to solve the immediate problem of where they were to live until the society's mission was feasible. Deeply disappointed by the response, Dr. and Mrs. Parker decided to accept the offer of a new medical work in Ningpo. While Hudson supported his friend's decision, he was left in even more uncertainty. His colleagues were leaving. His home was gone. And with no accommodations to be found even in the native city, how was he to remain in Shanghai to continue his work? In the midst of his discouragement, Hudson began to develop an idea. If he could not get a home on shore, why not take to the boats as many Chinese did and live on the water? That would coincide nicely with something else he'd been thinking about. He had made up his mind that the best way to live among and minister to the Chinese was to adopt the Chinese custom of dress. Yes, he could see how it would work. He would take his few belongings to Ningpo when he went to escort the Parkers, and would return to a new life in which he would identify himself completely with the Chinese people to whom he had dedicated his life. Hudson realized that this was a momentous decision. Adopting Chinese dress would mean shaving the front part of his head and letting the hair grow long and back to be braided into a regulation kiu. No missionaries or any other foreigners conformed to such a custom. For an occasional journey, a Chinese gown might be worn over ordinary Western clothing, but to give up European clothing altogether in favor of Chinese dress would be another matter entirely. He would not only be criticized, his decision would probably result in total rejection. But it was access to the people that he desired. And his recent journey, 200 miles up the Yangtze River, in May, had convinced Hudson that much more could be accomplished by itinerant evangelism than many had supposed. But the weariness and strain of the journey had been largely due to the fact that he was wearing European clothing, a most outlandish costume to those who had never seen it before. Attention was continually distracted from his message by his appearance, which to his hearers was as undignified as it was comical. He was sure it would have been much easier if only he had been more suitably attired from the Chinese point of view. And if it furthered his relationship with the Chinese listeners, he decided that he didn't care what the foreign community thought. So he ordered a Chinese outfit made for his journey to Ningpo with the Parkers and readied himself for his personal cross-cultural transformation. It was an August evening when Hudson went down to the river to engage the junk that was to take the Parkers on the first stage of their journey. On the way, a Chinese stranger approached him, asking to his surprise if he was seeking a house for rent. Would a small one do? And in the Chinese city? Near the south gate there was such a house, but its builder had not yet quite finished, and the construction would be done shortly, but they had run out of money. In short, he couldn't complete the work. But if the house suited Hudson, no deposit would be asked, and it could probably be had for an advance of 6 months' rent. As if in a wonderful dream, Hudson Taylor followed his guide to the southern part of the city, and there found a small, compact house, perfectly new and clean, with 2 rooms upstairs, 2 on the ground floor, and a 5th across the courtyard for servants. Just the arrangement he needed for his work and in the locality he would have chosen. This last-minute answer to prayer seemed clear guidance from God that Hudson Taylor's work in Shanghai was not yet over. That same night he visited a Chinese barber for the beginning of his transformation from European to Chinese fashion. And the next morning he appeared for the first time in public dressed as a Chinese teacher, a man for the scholarly class. It was in his new costume that he accompanied the Parkers to their new home in Ningpo, and about which he wrote this amusing letter to his sister on August 28, 1855. My dear Amelia, by way of surprise, I mean to write you a letter, for I know that you've never received one before from a man with a long tail and a shaven head. But lest your head should be bewildered with conjecture, I'd better tell you at once that on Thursday last at 11 p.m., I resigned my locks to the barber, dyed my hair a good black, and in the morning had a proper queue plaited in with my own, and a quantity of heavy silk to lengthen it out according to the Chinese custom. Then, in Chinese dress, I set out with Dr. Parker, accompanying him about 100 miles on his way to Ningpo. This journey was made on occasion for evangelistic work, and now that I'm returning alone, I hope to have even better facilities for book distribution and preaching. But I have not yet commenced the recital of my tribulations, and as there is some doubt as to whether they will all go into a single letter, the sooner I begin, the better. First, then, it is a very sore thing to have one's head shaved for the first time, especially if the skin is irritable with prickly heat. And I can assure you that the subsequent application of hair dye for 5 or 6 hours, litharge 1 part, quicklime, freshy slack 3 parts, water enough to make a cream, etc., does not do much to soothe the irritation. But when it comes to combing out the remaining hair, which has been allowed to grow longer than usual, the climax is reached. But there are no gains without pain, and certainly if suffering for the thing makes it dearer, I shall regard my queue when I attain one with no small amount of pride and affection. Secondly, when you proceed to your toilet, you no longer wonder why many Chinese in the employ of Europeans wear foreign shoes and stockings as soon as they can get them. For native socks are made of calico and, of course, are not elastic, and average toes decidedly object to be squeezed out of shape, nor do one's heels appreciate their low position in perfectly flat-soled shoes. Next come the breeches. But oh, what unheard-of garments! Mine are 2 feet too wide for around the waist, which amplitude is laid in a fold in front and kept in place by a strong girdle. The legs are short, not coming much below the knee, and wide in proportion with the waist measurement. Tucked into the long white socks, they have a bloomer-like fullness, capable, as Dr. Parker remarked, of storing a fortnight's provisions. No shirt is worn, but a white washing jacket with sleeves as wide as ladies affected 20 years ago supplies its place. And over all goes a heavy silk gown of some rich or delicate color, with sleeves equally wide and reaching 12 or 15 inches beyond the tips of one's fingers, folded back, of course, when the hands are not in use. Unfortunately, no cap or hat is used at this season of the year, except on state occasions, which is trying as the sun is awfully hot. Wednesday, August 29th. I do not know, dear Amelia, whether you are weary of these details, but I have no time for more upon the subject, so will dismiss it with only a mention of the shampooing I got from the barber the other day. I thought I had better go in for it as part of the proceedings, for I might be in difficulty some day if found to be uninitiated. So I bore with an outrageous tickling as long as I could, and then the beating commenced, and my back was really sore in places before it was over. On the next occasion, however, I stood it better, and I hope to acquit myself creditably in time with regard to this phase of the barber's art. While still with Dr. Parker on the way to Hangzhou Bay, I was frequently recognized as a foreigner because of having to speak to him in English, but today, going about Hudson City, no one even guessed that such a being was near. It was not until I began to distribute books and see patients that I became known. Then, of course, my men were asked where I came from, and the news soon spread. Dressed in this way, one is not so much respected at first sight as one might be in foreign clothing, but a little medical work soon puts that all right, and it is evidently to be one's chief help for the interior. Women and children, it seems to me, manifest more readiness to come for medical aid now than they did before, and in this way, too, I think the native costume will be of service. I was the interior that more and more filled his thoughts and his prayers, even as he settled into his new home in Shanghai. Everything he did was in preparation for that calling, and in that preparation Hudson soon found great encouragement.